Studios.
Before we begin, a content warning. This episode contains discussions of murder, violence, and trauma. Listener discretion is advised. The following story is drawn from public records, historical reporting, and community accounts. Some victim names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. Where the historical record contains gaps, certain narrative elements have been carefully reconstructed for clarity. Legal outcomes are described as they are recorded at the time of trial. Abingdon, Virginia, known for its historic buildings and small-town charm, was a busy place, even back in 1942. People coming and going, traffic moving through town, Main Street already alive before most folks had finished their first cup of coffee. And it wasn't the kind of town where you'd expect anything out of the ordinary. One of the busier streets, Wall Street, near the train and bus stations, was the first place many visitors saw when they entered this Appalachian community. And on a Friday the 13th morning in March, felt like any other in this part of Appalachia. Pat's Cafe, an all-night restaurant on Wall Street, was getting ready for the breakfast crowd. As two young men, dressed in Army uniforms, walked in, sat down in the 7th booth from the front door, and ordered their breakfast. Nothing about them stood out. With World War II ongoing, seeing traveling soldiers was a pretty common affair. As the waitress turned to pour their coffee, two other men, who had just met each other for the first time that morning, dressed in dark suits and wearing fedora hats, stepped inside and walked straight to their table. One of the two men asked the soldiers one simple question, and that one question would set off one of the largest manhunts this area had ever seen. If you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday, and if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. Those two men sitting in that cafe that morning, they didn't come out of nowhere. One of them, 21-year-old James Edward Testerman, was from right here in Southwest Virginia. He was born in Clinchburg, a community not too far from Abingdon, the kind of place where people don't have to ask who you are to know something about you. The other, 22-year-old Charles Joseph Lovett, was from Philadelphia, a long way from the kind of place Testerman came from, and a different kind of life altogether. Two young men from two very different backgrounds. But in early 1942, they had something in common. They were both in the Army. Like a lot of young men their age during that time, they had ended up in uniform. Some went willingly, some didn't have much of a choice, but either way, they found themselves in the same system, following the same orders, heading in the same direction. And for both of them, that direction led to the same place. Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, just a few miles across the state line from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And that's where their paths crossed, both assigned to the machine gun troop of the 3rd Cavalry, and that's where everything that followed started to take shape. The United States was just 3 months into World War II, after the December 7th attack on Pearl Harbor, and places like Fort Oglethorpe were full of young men trying to figure out what their place was going to be in the war. Some handled it better than others. Most kept their heads down, did what they were told, counted the days between letters from home. But not everyone adjusted to it in the same way. And somewhere along the way, something changed for Private Lovett and Private Testerman. There's no record that explains it. What or why? No letter, no statement, nothing. Just the outcome. And the outcome started on the night of Wednesday, March the 11th, 1942. It was a peaceful night on the base at Fort Oglethorpe. Most of the soldiers were asleep in their barracks. Only the sentries and the night duty guards awake and on patrol. The pair had spent the evening on approved leave in Chattanooga before returning to the base around 3:30 a.m. And when they returned, they approached their sergeant, who was supervising the night duty staff, and out of nowhere, the two began attacking him. A planned attack, The unsuspecting sergeant, having no time to react, tried to fend off Privates Lovett and Testerman, but with them having the element of surprise, and it being 2-on-1, they continued to attack him. The sergeant tried to hold his ground, but he was outmatched before it ever even had time to turn into a fight. Struck, repeatedly, until he couldn't stay on his feet. And once he was down, and no longer an obstacle in their way, they took what they came for from the storeroom he was guarding. 4 Smith & Wesson 45 caliber revolvers and 100 rounds of ammunition. Everything they needed to make sure that whatever came next, they would have the firepower they would need. And just like that, it was done. No alarms going off right away. No one stepping in to bar their exit. Just 2 soldiers walking away from the place they were supposed to be, now in their possession, weapons that they had no business taking, and leaving behind their sergeant, who was unable to stop them. And that was the moment everything changed, because up until then, they had a way back. Whatever they were feeling, whatever they had been building, it could have stopped there. They could have turned around, faced the consequences for what they had just done. But once they stepped off that base with unauthorized firearms in their possession, there was no going back. From that point on, there weren't soldiers in the army anymore. They were deserters and criminals on top of that, armed ones. And whether they fully understood that in that moment or not, they had already set something in motion that wasn't going to stay confined to that base for very long. The pair of deserters were now going to need a way to get as far away from that place as they could. Without a vehicle of their own, and knowing running on foot was not an option, just outside the gates they found a cab. Just a man doing his job. Picking up what looked like 2 regular fares. Nothing about it would have made him think twice at first. The 2 men got in, gave him directions, and for a moment it probably felt like any other trip. But it didn't stay that way for very long. Not long into the ride, the driver realized something wasn't right, as one of the men stuck a gun in his ribs, and the other in the back seat pressed a gun to his neck and told him, "Don't move an inch, or we will drill you." From that point on, the ride wasn't his anymore. They told him to head north and to keep driving, and that's exactly what he did. There wasn't much else he could do. He wasn't dealing with someone trying to scare him. He was dealing with 2 men who had already crossed the line. The drive stretched on like that, mile after mile. Every moment mattered. Every second mattered. He knew it, and they knew it. At some point along the way, they made it clear they weren't going back. They told the cab driver that we're getting out of this army and we're never going back. And hearing that, sitting behind the wheel with a gun close enough to remind you it was real, you start to realize this may be the last fare you ever take. As the driver continued, they crossed out of Georgia and into Tennessee, still heading north, still putting distance between themselves and what they'd left behind at Fort Oglethorpe. And then, just like that, it was over. Near Cleveland, Tennessee, they told the driver to pull over, robbed him of his $35 he had, and left him standing on the side of the road as the pair continued on. He was alive, and to him, that's all that mattered. From there, things get less clear. There are conflicting stories as to where the pair went next and how they got there. One version says they continued driving the cab, and others say they ditched the cab and eventually caught a bus. Either way, what we do know is that they stopped in Knoxville, Tennessee, and bought a handbag to conceal their weapons and ammunition, and eventually they made their way to Abingdon, Virginia. One of them would have known the area, the other wouldn't, but they didn't act like strangers passing through. They walked into town like they had a reason to be there. They didn't end up in Abingdon by accident. There was a reason they went there. They had a connection in mind, a girl living in the area, someone Testerman knew. Maybe someone he thought would help them, and that was enough to bring them into town instead of passing on through. So, that Thursday night, March 12th, they found a place to stay at the Martha Washington Inn, now one of the most luxurious hotels in the region and a cornerstone in Abingdon. They checked in like any other travelers. Nothing about it raised concern on its own, using the money they had stolen from the cab driver. From the outside, it would have looked ordinary, 2 soldiers in town getting a room. But by that point, what they had done in Georgia and Tennessee had already begun making its way through law enforcement channels. Their descriptions had been sent out. And not far away, there were men making their way toward Abingdon, men who knew about the connection between Testerman and the girl. And at that point, whether they realized it or not, Testerman and Lovett were being looked for. And for the moment, they just hadn't been found yet. Abingdon wasn't some out-of-the-way place where strangers stood out right away. Even back then, it was a town where people came through for business, for court, for trade. You could walk in its streets without anyone asking too many questions, especially if you didn't give them a reason to. Now, they had to decide what they were going to do with that 250 miles they had put between themselves and the base in Georgia. There's no clear record of what that conversation looked like, or if there was even one. No one heard it, and neither of them ever laid it out in a way that explains it. But whatever they decided, it didn't involve laying low for long. That night, they found an all-night diner, Pat's Cafe, on Wall Street, and went in and enjoyed a late-night meal. The next morning, they went back out. The streets were already moving the way they always did. Businesses opened up, people coming and going, nothing out of the ordinary for that time of day. And around 9:15 Friday morning, the pair headed back to Pat's Cafe for breakfast. They walked in, took a seat in a booth, and ordered their breakfast, biscuits and gravy for Testerman, and 2 eggs over easy for Lovett. No attention drawn to themselves. Just 2 men sitting there like they didn't have a care in the world, and for a few minutes, that's exactly how it looked. But as they were making their way to that cafe, 2 men and a blacked-out 1942 Chevrolet sedan was driving into town and spotted them. Fitting the description of the men who they were looking for, they followed them and watched them walk into Pat's Cafe. And inside that cafe, it was just a normal morning. And for a few minutes, nothing happened. Then the door opened, and the 2 men from the blacked-out sedan came in and paused just inside, taking a quick look around before heading towards the back. They weren't loud, and they didn't storm in. To anyone watching, it would have looked like just 2 more customers walking in, but their attire may have brought a little attention to themselves. Their dark suits and fedoras signified something. But they weren't there for breakfast. They walked straight towards the booth where Lovett and Testerman were sitting and stopped right beside the table, close enough that it changed the feel of that space immediately. One of them spoke, calm, direct, nothing raised or urgent about it. He identified himself as Special Agent Tigner with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and asked to see the military private's identification. Testerman spoke first, saying that he did not have any identification on him. Then Lovett answered differently. He said, "I have all it takes to identify me." And that's when it all broke loose. There wasn't a long build-up to it, no argument, no warning that gave anyone time to understand what was about to happen. Lovett moved first. He reached into his pocket. Instead of bringing out identification, he brought up a gun and fired. The first shots hit before anyone in that room could react. Agent Tigner went down immediately, falling right there beside the booth onto the feet of the waitress. The other agent, Treacy, attempted to draw his gun and was unable to do so before he was shot and fell. Agent Tigner tried to respond. Wounded, lying on the floor underneath the booth, he drew his weapon and began firing at the suspects, he himself being struck repeatedly with bullets. Customers in the cafe dropped where they were or tried to get behind whatever they could reach, chairs, tables, the counter. Some froze, not even sure what direction the shots were coming from. As Lovett and Testerman backed away from the booth, guns still in their hands, and headed for the door, they continued to fire shots. Determined to not let the 2 men escape, Agent Tigner, with 5 bullet wounds, stood up and staggered after them, continually shooting at them as they made their escape. Inside, everything had stopped. Agent Treacy was already gone. Agent Tigner was still alive, but badly wounded. Out in the street, it didn't take long for things to start coming apart. Once the pair were outside, they didn't slow down. People nearby hadn't seen what had happened inside, but they knew something was wrong. The sound of gunfire carries when it's that close. Lovett and Testerman were looking for a way out of town. They didn't have one lined up. They were reacting, trying to stay ahead of what they knew would come next. Then they spotted a car. A man was behind the wheel driving down the street. and before he knew what was happening, they were on him. They jerked open the car doors and jumped in, one in the front seat and one in the rear, putting a gun into his ribs, telling him to drive slowly through town. For a moment, it looked like they might be in the clear, but the man behind the wheel had other plans. He had discreetly turned off the ignition, telling them the car wouldn't start. All the while, they repeatedly told him to get moving or else. But by then, word was already starting to spread. What had happened inside that cafe wasn't going to stay there for very long. And law enforcement was close. And driving to the scene of the chaos was Sergeant Combs of the Abingdon Police Department. As soon as he turned onto Wall Street, Lovett and Testerman began firing at his vehicle. As he blocked the car from being able to move, Testerman and Lovett took cover, one behind the car and the other behind the open door, as they continued the shootout with Sergeant Combs. Once again, with guns blazing, they ran across Main Street and attempted to commandeer another vehicle, this one occupied by 4 women. Testerman fired a shot into the rear of the vehicle and told the occupants to exit and leave the keys. All 4 women got out of the vehicle, and the driver refused to give up the keys. Lovett and Testerman, stunned that this lady wouldn't give up the keys, having no time to spare, took off on foot and headed out of town. And Agent Tigner had managed to get himself up and out of that building, even after being hit. He'd made it onto the street, weapon in hand, still trying to close the distance. But there's only so much a wounded body can take. After everything that had already happened and seen inside, the damage had caught up with him. He collapsed there in the street, unable to keep going. By that point, it wasn't just something happening in one part of town anymore. Once word got out that an FBI agent had been shot, this wasn't something that stayed local. It didn't take long before every available officer in the area was moving in. And J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, was overseeing the operation from the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and he had ordered 40 additional G-men, a slang term used to identify FBI agents that began in the 30s, short for government man, to assist with the manhunt from surrounding FBI field offices. So now you had the town police, county deputies, state police, and federal agents all working on the same problem at the same time. Some of the men had already been in nearby Bristol for FBI training that week, 75 men to be exact, and they were immediately summoned by teletype, 1940s version of email, to assist with the manhunt. It all added up fast. Cars moving out of town in every direction, roads being watched, people stopping to ask what was going on, and getting told just enough to understand it wasn't something they wanted to get involved in. And then it moved out past the main streets, and to the edges of town, and then beyond that. Fields, outbuildings, small homes sitting off the road, places where someone could disappear for a while if they knew where to go. Officers and agents went door to door, through every one of those buildings, every barn, every outbuilding, and every outhouse in the immediate vicinity. For a time, the 2 deserters managed to stay out of sight. They found themselves in the home of 2 women, a mother and a daughter. The daughter said she was polishing her silverware when she heard someone come in the front door. And she went in to see who it was, and there stood 2 soldiers in her living room, with guns in hands. Testerman then points the gun at her and tells her that we're on the run, don't tell anyone we're here, and we won't kill you. And then Lovett goes into the kitchen and points 2 guns at her mother's stomach. Her mother begins to cry, and Lovett, showing maybe a sign of tenderness, if you want to call it that, says, "Don't cry, we won't hurt you if you just keep your mouth shut." While looking out the window, they see a basement window across the street and decide to go hide there and leave the women alone. So, the pair runs across the street and breaks out the basement window and crawls down inside to make it their hiding place. After being on the run for over 2 hours, back in town, information came in about a house on the west side of Abingdon up on Taylor's Hill. A young boy reported that he had seen 2 men dressed like soldiers go into a basement. With this new information, now technically a posse of 100 men, armed with weapons primarily obtained from private citizens, including sawed-off shotguns, Tommy guns, and tear gas guns, converged on the house in Taylor's Hill in Abingdon. Officers moved in from different directions, spreading out all along the hillside, taking position behind trees, barns, and any other cover they could find. No one wanted to push in too fast on 2 men who had already shown what they're capable of, but making sure they had every means of escape covered. Inside, Lovett and Testerman hiding in the basement of a house that belonged to a family who had no connection to what was happening, just caught in the middle of it like everyone else. And then, Lovett and Testerman, determined to make a last stand, began firing shots at the posse. One bullet knocking the hat off the head of an officer, fire was returned. After a moment, orders were given for the pair to come out with their hands up, but they went unanswered. So, one member of the posse, destined to end this standoff, snuck up close to the house and shot tear gas into the basement window. And after a few moments, a piece of cloth showed first, a white handkerchief pushed out the window, a signal that things were about to change, a sign that they were surrendering. Hacking and coughing from the tear gas, the two deserters, Charles Joseph Lovett and James Edward Testerman, walked out with their hands in the air, only saying, "I guess you got us." And just like that, the part of it where they were running was over. Everything that came after that would be handled somewhere else, in a courtroom. Once they were in custody, things moved rapidly. They weren't held in Abingdon for too long. Given what had happened and who had been killed, there wasn't any chance they were going to be left anywhere without heavy control. They were moved under guard, handled by federal authorities, and brought into court not long after. From the start, there wasn't much question about what they were facing. When they were brought before a commissioner, the charges were read, and both men answered the same way: guilty. From there, the case moved forward to the United States District Court in Abingdon, where it would be heard in full. They went to trial just over a month later, on April 15th, 1942. Inside the courtroom, the government laid out what had happened step by step, building it from the beginning. And on day 2 of the trial, one of the defense attorneys, assigned by the court to represent Lovett and Testerman, reported that his car had been stolen and wrecked on a mountain several miles from Abingdon. Whether that had anything to do with the case or not, nobody could really say for sure, but it gives you a sense of the kind of tension that was surrounding this trial. The prosecution brought in its witnesses, 72 to be exact. The sergeant from Fort Oglethorpe, the cab driver who they carjacked just outside the base, the waitress who had been standing there when it happened, testified about what she saw, how the agents approached the table, how the question was asked, and how everything quickly turned. She made it clear that the agents didn't fire their weapons, that the shooting started from Lovett, and that it continued even after both men were down. Agent Charles Tigner, who miraculously survived, with 5 gunshot wounds, also testified, still in the hospital, moved to the courtroom by ambulance. He told the court through what happened from his side, from the moment they entered the cafe to the point where he was hit. He described how there was no time to react, no opportunity to draw his weapon before the shots were already coming. Medical testimony followed, explaining the wounds, confirming what had been seen by those in the room. Then came the physical evidence. The weapons taken from Fort Oglethorpe were brought into the case. Ballistics experts testified that the bullets recovered matched those firearms, tying the earlier assault directly to what happened in Abingdon. It connected everything, from the base, to the cab, to the cafe. The defense didn't dispute what had happened as much as they tried to explain it. The 2 men on trial testified themselves, and the only reason ever given for their escapades was they didn't like the Army and thought they could get away. The defense argued against the death penalty, asking the jury to consider more than just the act itself. They pointed to the ages of the 2 men, their backgrounds, the fact that they were young and had not lived much of their lives yet. When it went to the jury, it didn't take long. They came back with first-degree murder. And that part wasn't surprising, but they added something to it. They recommended against the death penalty. The judge accepted it, and just like that, it was decided. Both men were sentenced to life in federal prison. No delay, no drawn-out process. After the trial, things moved out of sight. Lovett and Testerman were taken from the area and placed into the federal system. And after that, what happened to them slipped out of everyday view. Around Abingdon, people didn't see it anymore the way they did at the beginning. Their names were still there, but not out in the open. Instead of being in the newspaper every day, they were now in records and in files, in places most people never go. And over time, they became something you had to go looking for to find. And over time, the details faded for most, but not all. In 2017, on the 75th anniversary of that morning, a plaque was placed in Abingdon to remember Special Agent Hubert J. Treacy Jr. on the site of the former cafe, which is now the current site of the U.S. Post Office. It wasn't something large or meant to draw a crowd. It was there to mark the place, to make sure what happened there wasn't completely lost to time. The event was organized by the town and the families of Special Agent Treacy and Special Agent Charles L. Tigner, including Treacy's grandson, who followed a similar path to the FBI. He never had the chance to meet his grandfather, but has said that what happened to him is what led him to become an agent himself. And if you stand there now, you wouldn't see what happened. You wouldn't hear it. You wouldn't know it unless someone told you. It looks like just any other part of town. And that's usually how it goes. Around here, the roots are easy to see. It's the shadows that take a little longer to understand. Because in a place like Abingdon, you've got the things people hold on to, the history you can point to and see. And then you've got the parts that sit a little further back, the ones that don't come up as often, the ones that change things in a way that doesn't fully go away. And sometimes, those two meet in a place as ordinary as a cafe on Wall Street in Abingdon, Virginia, on a morning that started like any other, until it didn't. And if you're wondering, what became of the others in this story? Well, the Army sergeant recovered from his injuries. Special Agent Charles Tigner recovered, but his daughter said that the event haunted him every day of his life. A long life, too. He died in 2014 at the age of 101. And as far as the two deserters, the one who caused the mayhem in Abingdon as it was referred to, well, maybe the government was showing others that you don't mess with J. Edgar Hoover's G-Men. Their life sentences were to be carried out by serving hard time at one of the most notorious, feared, and secured prisons in the United States of America, where the worst of the worst were housed. Charles Joseph Lovett became inmate number 616, and James Edward Testerman became inmate number 716 at The Rock, or the place otherwise known as Alcatraz. This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one.